All right, everybody, welcome to the Plex interview. My name is producer Dave. With me via remote, I have John Atack. He's the author of several books about cults, including Scientology specifically, but also books that discuss systems of control and manipulative groups more broadly. How you doing, John?
I'm good, thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, and I just want to give a quick shout out to Karen de la Carriere for introducing us. She's been really helpful and supportive of what we do, so I just wanted to say hi to her while we were on the record here.
Yeah, she's an amazing person. She really is.
Yeah, we interviewed her. She was one of my first interviews, and I think it went pretty well. I was pretty nervous because I'd never interviewed anybody who had any notoriety before I spoke with Karen, so it was pretty cool.
Fair enough.
She's really accessible and kind of great, which is one of the good things about her, I think.
Yeah, when I was in touch with her by email, and when I finally met her face to face, I was just bowled away. She is such a gentle and sweet person. She really is.
Well, here's to you, Karen. So, John, can you tell us a little bit about the Open Minds Foundation before we get going here?
Absolutely. The Open Minds Foundation, we now have centres in the UK, in Holland, and in the US. We're looking at opening a node in Belgium. We have 501c3 status in the US for anybody who'd like to give us money. And we have charitable status in Holland as well. We're still working on the UK. The idea was basically many years ago, having worked very intensely on Scientology and on talking to very committed, fanatical Scientologists and been successful in helping them to reconsider their involvement with Scientology, I started to realize that the few of us who are doing this sort of exit counseling work, along with my close friend Steve Hassan, for example, or my friend Christian Shirko here in the UK, that we developed tools that were not generally known. And so about 25 years ago, I started looking at how to apply these ideas to such problems as terrorist radicalization or gang formation or paedophile grooming. And it just kept spreading because the psychology behind these things is the same, because it's human psychology. And rather than the kind of uninformed perception out in the public at large that cult members are kind of weak, vulnerable, gullible people, my experience was that there were some pretty high-flying people who'd been enmeshed in cults. So, for example, in Scientology, I knew 8 doctors of medicine in the UK alone. I knew 3 dentists. I knew a NASA scientist, indeed one of the leading people on the Apollo missions in developing them was a Scientologist. There are, of course, eminent musicians, Chick Corea among them, actors, we won't go into that. That there were very competent people involved in cults. So it fascinated me to try and understand how such people were attracted into these groups, because having been myself a Scientologist for 9 years, from the age of 19 to the age of 28, and done 25 of their then 27 levels, so I'd done the upper levels, where you're told you're inhabited by millions of little beings. Having done that and believed it for 9 years, it was, and believed it consistently. I didn't really question it until after I left. And I only left because I thought that Ron Hubbard had gone, and that these nasty Commodore's messengers, these teenagers who'd served him, had taken over. And I left because of that. And I realized within a matter of weeks that Hubbard was actually a pathological liar. And there's no way around that, because it's not a matter of what anybody else said about him. He himself contradicted himself frequently and often. So how was it that I hadn't seen that? How had I been taken in? How were people being taken in? And I came to realize that if you look at the dynamics of, say, an abusive marriage, an abusive partnership, that you see something similar. You find, people will say, well, why didn't you leave when your partner started hitting you? And they'll tell you how loving the partner is at some times. And I mean, that's a problem which is called disorganized attachment. There's a wonderful book by one of our advisory board members, Alex Stein, called Terror, Love and Brainwashing. She was in a socialist group, very repressive socialist group, and she explains that you create an attachment with the leader of the group, or your toxic partner, or what have you, where you seek comfort in the world from that person, but they're the person abusing you. And though I have to say that never happened to me. When I was involved in Scientology, I had actually quite a good time. It was only after I left that they started ferociously harassing me that my life became difficult. But I think Alex is right that most people develop this kind of disorganized attachment. In a child, it would be like having a parent who says, "Oh, come here, I love you," and when you get to them, they slap you around the head. That this has got mixed up, and that this emotional attachment, I think, you'll find it if you talk with radicalized terrorists, and I would differentiate Western terrorists from those who grow up in a country. For Palestinians, for example, their situation is very different to the terrorists who Mohammed Atta and his followers who did the dreadful things on 9/11, because most of those people were actually graduate students from Western universities, often with technical degrees, and they had, this disorganized attachment, this change in their relationship to the world had happened. I don't think that's necessary, if you live in Sri Lanka or, in the Basque regions of Spain, or whether you're actually part of a culture that feels itself oppressed. What happens with cult members and what happens with radicalized terrorists here in the West is that they're put into a relationship where they will do crazy things. And it's not a matter of their education. It's not a matter of them having any kind of mental disorder. They're not dependent. They don't have the dependent personality disorder or anything like that. So, quite a long story. I saw that and started working to try and bring people from different disciplines together back in about 1991. And I was entirely unsuccessful because all of the people in the counter-cult field were then and are now completely overwhelmed by the task at hand. There are so many damaged former members. There is so much pressure, particularly from Scientology, so much harassment, that they don't really have the time to. So eventually, Steve, Hassan, and I, we've been friends for 30 years. We sat down and talked about it. He went off and talked with this wonderful man, Dick Kelly, and we came together and we started finding people from the different disciplines so that we could find out more. We have a retired psychiatrist called Nick Child who has dealt with family psychiatry and is an expert on child alienation and how one parent will turn the child against the other parent after a separation. I've learned so much from his area that it applies. It applies to the way we form relationships in groups, and I think there are fundamental problems throughout our society that the way that gangs have burgeoned in the last 30 or 40 years, since the Crips and the Bloods started moving along, and after the wonderful man Tookie Williams, those gangs are now represented throughout all US cities. They control the traffic in hard drugs because we've not found a way of dealing with that. White supremacism is back. The Ku Klux Klan, which had almost disappeared in the 1980s, is now a rampant force again. These forces of hatred. We have Islamophobia because of a tiny amount of Wahhabi Sunnis have become Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Daesh. Now there's this hatred towards all Muslims who don't really, so I think there are forces in our society, and the idea with the Open Minds Foundation was to bring together experts, ignore the sociologists who seem to say there's nothing you can do about it, there is no real problem, and try and, for free, online, bring tools into society that are preventative. Many of us have spent years and years picking up the pieces afterwards in recovery, but we want some preventative medicine here to show people what human predators are like, the sort of form they take, the kind of narcissists and people who bully us and push us around and get us involved as their followers. How to recognize their seduction and recruitment techniques, which once you're familiar with them, it doesn't matter what group you go to, you will find the same approaches because people are the same all over the world. So that's a very long answer to your question.
Oh, no, that's okay. We have some time here. I don't have anything to do till my show later tonight, so it's all good. I have a couple prepared questions, but I do have just one quick follow-up on your answer to the last one. You said that the cult of Scientology gave you the business for a while. How long would you say that went on after you left the cult, or is it ongoing?
16 years. I left in October 1983, so 34 years ago. And I was horrified by what I'd found out. I'd been ordered to disconnect from a friend of mine, to shun, ostracize a friend. I refused to do that. I spent 6 months, writing various appeals to try and get justice for him. There was no chance of that. The system didn't permit it. He'd been put on a list of suppressive people. Without any hearing, without any evidence, and I was horrified by that. And then I started finding out what the Guardian's Office of Scientology had been doing, and that it had been systematically harassing critics. The operation against Paulette Cooper is beautifully recorded in The Unbreakable Miss Lovely by my good friend Tony Ortega. Paulette's also a good friend. And she was just a journalist who dared to speak the truth about Scientology. And Ron Hubbard himself wrote an operation against her called Operation Freakout, the intent of which was to have her incarcerated either in prison or a mental hospital. It certainly appears from the records that the FBI seized from Scientology that part of their intent was to force her to commit suicide. And they came very close. Paulette was really worn down. And finding out about this harassment, I believed that I was part of this wonderful organization that was creating a society without war, without insanity, and without crime. And to find out that it was actually a criminal society that was making insane war upon the people who disagreed, that was incredibly disappointing. I felt shamed. I hadn't done any of that. I didn't know about any of that. And that made me feel guilty because I should have understood, that what was happening. And so I stood up and I spoke out. I was the first person ever in the UK to have a public meeting and say, what are we going to do about this? And it started straight away. They started following me. They started sending people around to talk to me who were pretending to have defected. Things would be stolen from my house. I'd realize when these people left. My house was broken into a couple of times. There was a third time when a chap begged a key from a neighbor and he was coming into my house. And, as I came down the stairs, they had a guy for a couple of years in a house across the road filming to see who came to my door. Somebody tried to walked into my bank and tried to get details of my bank. And there were scary things, being followed all over the place and having, people with placards marching up and down outside your house or wherever you go to speak. The idea and the noisy investigation, this famous Scientology policy, how to do a noisy investigation, approved by Ron Hubbard, written by Kathy Gogoley, which basically says you ring people up, you say, I'm investigating this critic for criminal activity. I've got some fantastic information so far. What have you got to tell me? Now, they sent a private detective called Eugene Ingram all around the world to try and pick up, scandal about me so that they could, they actually published a booklet which they pushed through all the doors in East Grinstead, where I was living at the time. So thousands of these nasty little booklets. They accused me of all sorts of things. I'd have the police coming along. Actually, at one point, they convinced the police to search my house for breach of a violation of copyright. And I think the police were rather embarrassed when they realised that, criminal copyright is not really was not really happening. The fact was I'd made a few copies of single pages, a few pages here and there of Scientology material for people. And to get a full-on police raid, 4 police officers rifling through all of my files, and in the end they had to basically listen to me because, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents they weren't going to go through. But they took away all these things in evidence bags, and 3 months later they returned everything to me without any apology. And you sort of realize that Scientology can make these things happen. It can get newspapers to sack editors. It can, for 21 years after my book, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which remains the only history of the movement, for 21 years there was no other book in the English language. Now, Scientology has become fair game because the media have discovered Scientology, and they found that it doesn't fight back in the way that it used to, because I think they've realized that they've created such bad publicity for themselves through this vicious, this is the most litigious organization in the history of the world. And that's, I'm not kidding. They managed to drop, I think it was 3,000 lawsuits in a single day after the IRS settled with them. And before that, they'd had thousands of other lawsuits. So, I don't think any group has been as eager to use litigation. Hubbard said the law can be used very easily to harass, and that if it was possible, you should ruin an opponent utterly. You should destroy their lives. And this is meant to be a religion of some kind, So, yeah, for about 12 years, they interfered with every aspect of my life. Their head of investigation in the UK came to harass me and ended up confessing to me back in 1993. And I was told that I had 5 people working on me, 4 people already in my close circle and 1 in training. So I did quite a lengthy podcast with Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, a few weeks ago, where I talked about the harassment. But yeah, it was 12 years. And then eventually, having been dragged through the courts in New York, we won the case in New York. We got the book published. But, Piece of Blue Sky is the only book ever to have been restrained from publication in the United States that did not have an effect upon national security. Indeed, there's only been one other book, which was written by a CIA defector. So, it got pretty unpleasant. Then for 4 years after I basically stopped and said, I can't do this anymore. I had no financial support. So I was having to, involve myself with litigation, consulting to litigation, which was easy to do because there were hundreds of people being sued by Scientology, and do media work and do exit counselling so that I could see as many ex-members as possible and help them, through the post-traumatic stress that so many people suffer after Scientology. So yeah, it was pretty harsh.
Okay, you had brought up your book, a piece of blue sky, about Scientology, and this hit the scene a long time before the internet, and it contains a lot of the same descriptions of human rights abuses that are common knowledge now as a result of the internet. I think you may have just answered this question, but how did you find out about all that stuff without just being able to Google it?
Yeah, well, that it can be Googled is partly because I didn't leave the scene until 96. So with the help of Chris Owen, who's a remarkable historian, we put all of the information that we thought was relevant on the internet. So things like the 800-page training for harassment people, what's called the Information Full Hat, it went online. So we were there at the birth of the internet, and the EFF were there to defend me bless them. I've had to gather material in the old-fashioned way, which was I would write letters. I was the first person after Hubbard died to access all of his records, his Navy records, his Veterans Administration records, his FBI records, hundreds and hundreds of pages. He grew up in Helena, Montana, so, and claimed that his grandfather owned a quarter of Montana. That quarter of Montana proved to be a 120-acre half section. So the great cattle rancher actually was a veterinarian who kept a few horses. I found out about that from the Montana Historical Society. So, I got all sorts of records. Then I worked with the Sunday Times journalist Russell Miller. He hired me as a researcher for some stories for the Sunday Times and for a biography of Hubbard called Barefaced Messiah. And he went out and interviewed. He found one of Hubbard's aunts was still alive, Margaret Roberts. He interviewed her, and her stories kind of contradicted what he'd said about his childhood. But then you can find him contradicting those stories too. There's almost nothing he claimed that he doesn't somewhere else contradict. I pored over the Scientology material, some of the more obscure lectures, and found a great deal of material there that was relevant. The important thing was that when I was in Scientology, I read Cyril Vosper's Mindbenders. Cyril later became a very dear friend. I read Christopher Evans' Cults of Unreason. Sadly, he was dead by the time I left, so I couldn't get to know him. And I skimmed my way through Road to Total Freedom by the sociologist Roy Wallace, who I also later came to know a little bit, by telephone. And they didn't convince me at all. So when I set about writing something, I knew I'd have to have absolutely watertight references. I'd have to be able to direct people to sources, and I'd have to check everything. And so I generally went for, if I was telling a story about something that had happened, real events, I like to find a second witness to everything. There was only one story in the end that was conflictual, and that was that before St. Hill in East Grinstead, where Hubbard lived in the south of England, before they had a canteen on site, there was a guy who used to bring his little kiosk along and open it up. And this story went that one day he'd had no apple pie, and as a consequence had been declared a suppressive person. And I talked to 3 people about that, and there was one person who absolutely assured me this had not happened, but there were 2 other people who were there at the time who said it had. And it's such a good story, you've got to use it.
Oh, you have to use that. Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Yes, exactly, apple pie. It's very important.
Imagine if Ron Hubbard ran the government and somebody's like, what are you in for? And they're like, apple pie.
Yeah, that's it. And when you look at, in Scientology, they have their own prison labor force, their rehabilitation project force. And when you look at some of the crimes that people are assigned to this for, my good friend Jerry Armstrong basically was making a little film for Hubbard. And he impersonated Carnival Barker at the start. Ladies and gentlemen, this kind of thing. And he was assigned to the Rehabilitation Project Force, where I can't remember how long he served, but people quite typically do 2, 3, even 4 years of forced labor, basically, where they're considered to be scum. They're humiliated and degraded. Again, when it wasn't until I left that I found out this was happening. And I felt, why didn't I see this? Why didn't I understand this? And you get that the people involved are so fanatical that they won't tell you what they're suffering, that they're not allowed to talk to anybody, that they eat rice and beans every day, that they work a 90-hour week for about 2 cents an hour, They just won't tell you, because that would make Scientology look bad, So you have a conspiracy to cover up all the time. Once you've passed through the curtain and are part of this organization, or the Guardian's Office of Special Affairs, as it now is, you don't ever say anything nasty about it. It's like the cover-ups in the Catholic Church of the paedophile scandals, that we mustn't say this because people think we're a bad organization. You're going, you are a bad organization. Up until the point where you come clean and change your culture, you're a bad organization. And if you have to cover up, then, you shouldn't be doing what you're doing, particularly if you're doing it under the guise of spiritual advancement or following what God wants for people or something like that.
Okay. Wow. That's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
So
People have said that to me before,
So I want to switch gears a little bit here. I want to ask, since leaving, you've devoted your life to helping people who have been victims of cults and other manipulative groups. Do you think that if you hadn't had the Scientology experience, you'd be doing this right now?
No, there's no chance of it. And I think one of the really important, I think the world is changing at the moment. Not for any kind of wild new age reasons. I think people are becoming more aware. And so, if you think back historically to World War One, in Britain during World War One, the whole country got behind this ridiculous feud between the royal cousins of Europe. When it came to the invasion of Iraq in 2002, almost 2 million people, and our population is 64 million for the United Kingdom around that time. Almost 2 million people went out on the streets to demonstrate and say, no, not in my name. 80% of people didn't want to go. The government, Tony Blair and his friends, decided to go anyway. But it encouraged me tremendously that people are willing to stand up and they're willing to protest. With so many ex-cult members, and we really are talking about probably 10% of the population of the Western world has been involved in a destructive, authoritarian, totalist cult. Whether it's, all of the terrorist groups, all of the gangs, all of the destructive organizations that control their members, that enforce shunning. That's the point where I look at it, where you're told you cannot communicate to outsiders. That's the point where you're in a destructive cult. Where somebody tries to inhibit your freedom of association and your freedom of speech, then you're in a destructive cult. And I think these cult dynamics, which function throughout society, they function in big corporations, certainly, where there's often no real concern for people. And, they're antisocial, as the documentary The Corporation said. You could say that they're sociopathic because their concern is to make money. I know that that's not the truth about the corporate world because I've had some dealings with the corporate world. And I know that there are many people who are really very concerned. But as the law is structured at the moment, the tendency is to make profit, and who cares about what we do to people? I think there are a tremendous amount of people who are not happy with that. And ex-cult members, once they've digested their experience, which can take years. I mean, I left the Scientology field in the beginning of 1996. I just couldn't do it anymore. I didn't have the support. My health had collapsed. I'd been bankrupted solely through litigation from Scientology, solely through the costs of lawyers, not through there was no financial judgment against me at any point. But I couldn't do it anymore. And in 2013, I came back specifically to the subject of Scientology, having worked in the broader area during those 17 years. I came back because I realized that many former Scientologists were not recovering. They were going to spend the rest of their days, even if they didn't practice as so-called independent Scientologists, even if they didn't believe anymore, the reconstruction of their way of thinking, the behavioral modification that they'd been through, would stay with them. And so I started blogging at Tony Ortega's Underground Bunker just on that subject. And I anticipated that I would be harassed into the ground again. I was all ready for that. And then found that there were people, like Chris Shelton or Tony Ortega or now Leah Remini, who were far more important to Scientology, and their resources were stretched. So, they didn't come after me, apart from putting out some nasty rumors about me.
Like a web page, probably a web page about you. Yeah, that's one of their big ones.
I think there are a few out there, possibly. I don't really look, I must say, because, what's the point? There's no point arguing with them. And nobody believes them. Even if there were any true statements, negative statements about me on their website, nobody would believe it because they're known to be liars. They know it's known that they invent stories, and along the way, I had an Anglican priest who he was in Chichester where they'd set up a mission, and we worked together, and we closed the mission down in a couple of months. I think it's the only time it's been done, and it surprises me that people haven't come to me to talk about that, about how you can do something about it. That I'm considered to be a kind of historical expert who knows how to talk people out and has worked on a lot of litigation. But we managed to close down a bookstore in East Grinstead, the first time they'd ever dared open anything in the town of East Grinstead itself. They're about 4 miles out. And we closed down this place in Chichester. The vicar came to me and he said, I was at a meeting last week and this Scientologist came up to me and he said, oh, you don't want to deal with John Atack. He's a rapist. He's attempted murder. He's a paedophile. It's like they just make up the same stories about everybody and hope they'll stick. They've also accused me of being a heroin addict. I've never even seen heroin, let alone taken it, let alone become addicted to it. But this is the way they think, if they slur somebody enough. So, their propaganda campaigns don't tend to work because they've cried wolf too often and people know, that they just make things up,
Okay, so like in the current time outside of Scientology, because Scientology is definitely not ascendant right now, it doesn't seem like, do you see cult belief systems that are ascendant, possibly ones that, unlike Scientology, the internet helps to enable, not to suppress?
Absolutely. And, at one end of the scale, you've got a group like Free Domain Radio who are encouraging and managing to persuade young people to shun their own parents completely, and that is horrifying. It's just evil. The notion that your family of origin, as they call it, is in some way dangerous to you. My experience of life is absolutely and totally that without the support of my family, I wouldn't have been able to do anything. When Scientology was coming against me, it wasn't the ex-members who supported me, I'm sad to say. During a period of 12 years, apart from my business partner and then close friend, Mitch Beattie, who did, support what I was doing for a couple of years, bless him, I was given, in a 12-year period, I was given £20, about what, $25 by ex-members. So there was no support from the ex-member community. Without family, I wouldn't have been able to do this. And, my mother was involved with Scientology. She came in after me to see if it was safe and decided she really liked it and stayed in for 8 years, left at the same time I did. So, she maybe had some incentive, but the rest of my family were not involved. My brothers and one of my nephews who, without them, I wouldn't have been able to do what I've done. And it's really taught me that, a stable family is the most important building block of a sane society and a good society, that the love you receive, in a secure family environment. So here's this, expletive human being in Canada sitting down and telling people, 17 and 18-year-olds don't have anything to do with your family. He's cutting off their lifeline. There are other cults. There are these little cults that tell people they're doing charitable work for children. Recently encountered a couple of these in Europe. And they say, oh, but you won't be able to see your family while you're doing this work. You won't be able to talk to them. I mean, if you look at the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, they have this policy of sending out teenagers as missionaries. And for 2 years, they're not allowed to communicate with their own family. These are wrong and bad things. So anyway, at one end, you've got these cults which are burgeoning. And at the other end, you've got things like Facebook and Google, which they've entered into this cultic milieu because they are scooping up our data and using it, for their financial benefit. This whole like and dislike business, the amount of information that we're giving away that is then being used to target us, not simply commercially, which I don't approve of, trying to sell us things, but also politically. That, in the recent US election, there were bots functioning. You didn't just have the Russian APT-28 infiltrating the election, possibly. but both sides were using, Twitter and creating a false situation. And we need to be very careful about that when significant and powerful groups, political parties like the Republicans and the Democrats, start using the tools of cults, then we're in trouble because they have such power, they have such massive influence. So there's a whole spectrum from the little homemade groups that are going onto the internet through to the internet providers themselves, and the advantage that they're taking of the clause in US law that they're not liable for anything they publish, which should probably be modified to say if they're notified that they've published something libelous, then they should withdraw it. Not that they have to check all of their content before it goes up, but if somebody's being, seriously libeled, then they should probably do something about it, because at the moment, there's a free-for-all out here.
So that would be like similar to how the YouTube has to deal with copyright, where they're not expected to view every video to make sure it doesn't have copyrighted material, but if the copyright holder contacts them, they take the video down.
Yeah, I think so.
It was something like that would be probably much better. The problem would be that people get into so many damn Facebook arguments and call people, assholes and accuse people of being pedophiles all the time, that Facebook would have to start charging $20 a month for their service just to deal with the complaints of libel. You know what I'm saying?
I agree. And I think it's where we put the line that hate speech is the line here. And in the UK, the law is being changed and people are being sent to prison. There was a businesswoman who complained about the government's strategy for leaving the EU, Brexit as it's called, the European Union, and she won her case in the courts. And this chap put up this thing saying that he would give thousands of pounds if somebody were accidentally to run her over with their car. He's in prison now. Quite rightly, that inciting somebody to kill somebody else. I think, where you're calling somebody an asshole or in that kind of stuff, who cares? That's free speech. That's fine. But where you make specific charges against somebody that could ruin their livelihood, then I think you're in a different area. And it's not even a matter of prosecuting. It's just a matter of taking it down. I had a situation a few months ago. A friend of mine's a handyman, and somebody had put up this horrible post on a site which reviews people who do jobs around the house and stuff. And I wrote to these people and said, well, hang on a minute, I've known this guy for nearly 20 years. This is nonsense. And they went back to the person who had posted the complaint and said, you've got a week to justify what you said. They didn't hear from them. They took down the complaint. It also happened to have put up exactly the same, word for word, the same complaint about somebody else. So it was a bit suspicious. But I think there's that kind of duty towards the public from service providers. Otherwise, the other way we could go is the kind of great firewall of China, that we really don't want to get into a situation where the government is controlling these things, or the judiciary are controlling them. The internet, I still think, for the most part, is possibly the most wonderful thing to happen. I think Tim Berners-Lee made a great service to humanity with the World Wide Web, and saying, I don't want any money for it. Use it. Unfortunately, I'm not so happy about Facebook, Google, Amazon, these giant corporations that have emerged, which publicly, pretend to have an ethical culture, but factually are questionable ethically. That the profit motive is perhaps a bit too much. On the other hand, Google have funded the Khan Academy, which is a great boon to mankind, I think. So, it comes good and bad. But I think there are dangers of it becoming cultic when you have corporations that are pretty much run by a tiny group of individuals, or even a single individual. I have a profound problem with tyranny, with dictatorship, with monarchy, with all of these autocratic systems, I don't think that we are best served by giving that much power to a handful of individuals and trusting, that like Bill and Melinda, they'll go and fund vaccinations in the third world, which is great. I'd rather see a democratic society. How we achieve that, I don't know. I think the Swiss have got a pretty much democratic system, but they also are the biggest arms brokers in the world. So that hasn't entirely worked, And I don't like cuckoo clocks either. The chocolate's pretty good.
So you had talked about
we need an ethical basis to move forward, I think.
You had talked about, we've touched on the internet a little bit, and hopefully you at least looked into us a little bit before you came on this show. But one of the things we like to talk about is conspiracy theory. The moon landing, the 9/11, the one that we talk about most, I think, is the chemtrails conspiracy. And we've, as part of looking into this, partially because we're kind of trolly, but also in looking kind of into this for our show, we've gotten into some groups with chemtrails people, and I've started to, some of the people in there talk like Scientology spokespeople. And I was just wondering if you'd, in your work, run into people who were in like conspiracy cults, people who were, and that maybe that were recruited on the internet for such a thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a mindset that we're dealing with. And I mean, our thought at Open Minds is to help people to think more critically. The tools of critical thinking have largely been lost. Even if you go into a critical thinking course, you're pretty much being taught how to write essays that will pass examinations.
Or join a critical thinkers community on the internet, and you'll see how quickly it homogenizes, and the people who don't kind of follow the prescribed dogma are removed.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, there is an Italian organization, academic organization. There was a piece in Scientific American about their work, and they'd analyzed, I think it was 55 million probably Facebook posts, and they were looking at two groups of people. The one group were scientists, and the other group were conspiracy theorists.
Oh God, can you send me a link to this?
Yeah, I will do.
Thank you.
What they did was they then, with the conspiracy theorists, they then went to them and offered hard evidence that they were wrong. And they said that watching their Facebook traffic, they visited 30% more or spent 30% more time on conspiracy sites after they'd been given the evidence. Now, you trace this right back. This is Leon Festinger's, the great Leon Festinger, who gave us the notion of cognitive dissonance. In about 1956, he published a book called When Prophecy Fails. And what he'd done was he'd inserted two graduate students into a sort of offshoot of Scientology, in fact, a woman called Marian Keech. And she said that she was communicating with an alien. She was one of the first modern channelers, where trans mediums became channelers, and they stopped. The thing during the early 20th century was that they'd always channel American Indians for some reason, and now they started. It started being aliens who were coming, like Ramtha and what have you, who were coming through. She's one of the first. She had a live-in Scientology auditor, so she was really hot on Scientology. And what Festinger did was he put a couple of his graduate students into a rather tiny spaceship cult. And what he predicted was that after she'd said, right, the world's coming to an end, we're going to be lifted off by the mothership. And he didn't believe this. I'm not sure why. So he said, what will happen is this. Those who go to the hill to be picked up by the mothership, when it doesn't come, their belief will be stronger. Those who don't go to the hill will leave. And we got this notion of cognitive dissonance, that if our beliefs are challenged, it actually makes them stronger. That is the normal human practice. And learning to overcome cognitive dissonance in yourself, learning to welcome disagreement, hopefully politely put, agreeable disagreement is my buzz phrase for it. Welcoming that, saying, please, if there's anything I'm saying that's factually inaccurate, You know, let's talk about that. Give me the evidence. That's very difficult for us. We're not trained to do this in school. We're just trained to listen and be obedient and do as we're told. Um, my great friend Ira Chaleff wrote a wonderful, wonderful book called Intelligent Disobedience. You can find a little, if you put Blink, Think, Choice, Voice into Google, get this fantastic 2-minute video made for 5-year-olds to tell them that, no, if something seems wrong, say, oh, hang on a minute. And, the obedience culture leads to cults. It leads to people who, because they spent their time in school having to put their hand up to go to the toilets and, not being, you're not allowed to speak unless spoken to, this ancient culture, which is so wrong and academically doesn't succeed and socially doesn't succeed, as now hundreds and hundreds of schools around the world have shown. There are much better ways and you can get children to be curious and creative rather than bored out of their skulls, which is, trying to memorize the answers to SATs. Where have we gone? What is happening? So you can change that culture, which is very much at the heart of what we're trying to do at Open Minds, to say that there are actually thousands of people, tens of thousands of people out there who are doing something about this. It's been going on certainly since the 60s. People have come up with more and more and better ideas, like the studies in the 80s that showed that in puberty, melatonin release moves forward by about 2 hours. So if you have kids coming in school in the morning, they're going to be half asleep. And just, in many school districts in the US, they moved forward an hour or an hour and a half, and they found they were getting, less bad behavior and, better academic results. Probably if you moved the school starting time until noon, accepting that probably about 20% of 15-year-olds, their melatonin release means that they are sleep deprived all through the week. Probably if you moved the time forward, you'd have fantastic changes in society. It's such a ridiculous thought, but we know enough now about brain chemistry and we know enough about social psychology to say there are simple things you can do, that would help to make a better world.
Maybe not just children there either, because I'm fortunate. I don't have a schedule. I just go do my work. But there are people who just don't get up at 7 a.m, and we try to cram them in this box where they have to get up at 7 a.m, and so they're not going to do a good job. It's crazy that we do this.
And they'll be the places in the world like where you are and where I am that are stupid enough to try and change the clock by an hour for the summer. You get the road accidents. People die in the week after the clock change because they've had to force their clock. About 10% of people, 10%, 1 person in 10 suffers from delayed sleep phase syndrome, called owls, people who prefer to wait later. There's now evolutionary work that's saying, well, this group of people is partly why humanity was able to become the dominant species, because there was always somebody alert all through the night, all through the day, because of, you get advanced phase, people who wake up early. So between us, there was always somebody on watch through hundreds of thousands of years of the development, into Homo sapiens. Now, if you sleep late, and I'm diagnosed with delayed sleep phase syndrome, but I was only diagnosed in my late 30s. It started when I was 11 years old. I crawled into school until I was about 17, taking in very little of it. And then I just had to drop out of school because I couldn't do it. To find that 1 person in 10 has this condition, and that I suffered 25 years of being told I was lazy, because people think if you sleep at, between 4 in the morning and noon, you must be lazy. We're a a huge minority in this society, and with a 24-hour society, it's just an ancient prejudice. It's there's no reason, and of course the various genes, the periodicity gene, the PER3 gene, is polymorphic. There you go. That sounds smart, doesn't it? In people with DSPS, and the CRY1 gene is also has something odd about it. And we've known about the PER3 gene for 20 years. I talked with a sleep specialist a few months ago who'd never heard of it. I'm going, what? Where are we? Doctors are people who don't have this condition, right? To be a medical doctor, you have to be able to pull 80-hour shifts. Well, people with delayed sleep phase syndrome have jet lag if you interfere with their sleep cycle. So then forcing people to do this, and you go, oh, you mean this affects the whole of society? And it's like, yep, this is one of the simple things that, sleep hygiene and, getting enough sleep, being warm enough and having enough food of the right type and getting exercise. Yeah, these are actually fundamental, and, not consuming too much in the way of alcohol or other drugs. These are fundamental to health, to longevity, and to happiness. And our society, basically we have doctors who give people pharmaceuticals. I do believe in some of those conspiracy theories, by the way, the ones about the pharmaceutical companies.
Well, I think that there's a lot of layers on that, and it's not really a conspiracy theory, because the doctor is trying to adjust you to a world where you have to be up at 7 a.m. That's what you're going at.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what you want when you go there. And if there's a drug that can put you to sleep earlier, and so you can get up earlier, everybody gets what they want. There's no tinfoil hat required there. It's just not a good idea.
Yeah. What I'm talking about is really the way that the pharmaceutical companies have so consistently covered up their misdeeds. You had John le Carre's Constant Gardener, about a good film too, about the cover-ups in Africa, where drug companies were just testing things there. The last layer has been them using homeless people in the US, signing them up and giving them, and it's part of the structure. With the FDA rules, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to bring a pharmaceutical to market. And so you then have the pharmaceutical reps who are going out. In this country, it would be illegal to make the gifts that pharmaceutical companies make in the US to doctors. It's that simple. You can give them a ballpoint pen, but giving them a car, an automobile, would be frowned upon in our culture. So you're right. It's not a conspiracy. They're actually doing these things, and there's no doubt about it.
Well, and there's no hidden knowledge in it. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like a the way I look, the defining factor for me on a conspiracy theory is that I am awake and you're a sheep.
Yes.
And to think what we've been talking about the pharmaceutical industry, there's none of that there. We don't think that there's no special knowledge required. It's a for-profit business, and they're going to do everything they can to make money. Sound the alarm and alert the press.
Yeah, yeah. With some exceptions, I think the Wellcome Foundation is slightly different from the other major pharmaceuticals because it's fundamentally a charitable organisation. Very strange situation that a pharmaceutical company is they're actually working for the good of people, but because we've got this damn free market religion, that the idea that if you have a free market, everything else will work out. There are no free markets, of course. There never have been. The US subsidizes its farmers to fight off, so there is no free market. There are various tariffs, there are all sorts of things going on. But it's not what Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations. In fact, he said you should take the landlords, the rentiers, the capitalists, and shoot them. That was his idea. But he's been, pulled out and turned into this notion that if we just have a free market, and the same in medicine, the idea that a free market is going to solve our ills. Again, what's the profit in helping people who have delayed sleep phase syndrome? There is no research, no pharmaceutical companies doing anything. There is no sleeping pill that will work on us because that's one of the aspects of the condition, that we don't have a dysomnia. We have a dysomnia, not insomnia. So if I take a sleeping pill 6 hours before I'm meant to go to sleep, I'll feel groggy for 6 hours. It won't put me to sleep.
It might be fun depending on which one you take.
Well, I don't know, because these days, No, it's funny actually because I briefly took temazepam, which is a diazepine, many years ago. The doctor said, "Here, take this," and then I saw on the television that there were junkies who were they were just sticking a needle in one of these capsules, pulling the stuff out and fixing it up. And I saw this awful documentary where there was this chap. He fixed himself up and he got a cigarette burning in his other hand, and because he went straight to sleep or into the comatose state that this. So I stopped taking them. I decided they probably weren't a good idea, and of course he burned his fingers. The cigarette got him, but it yeah. So yeah. I didn't enjoy that one. Have you got, you might be able to suggest some better ones. Maybe it was the wrong drug for me.
Oh no, that's not really. Well, no, like sleeping pills. Like I don't really do anything other than like smoke a little bit of cannabis and drink some beer now. But like downers were never my thing. I didn't like them at all. Like I didn't. I like to go out and do things and stuff. Downers weren't really my thing. So hey, I do want to ask before we finish up here. Outside of the obvious money donations, is there any other kind of help that the OMF is looking for or would benefit from right now?
Very much so. We don't want to be a kind of hierarchical autocratic organization. We don't want to be the sort of thing that we criticize. We want to adopt, the World Wide Web internet model, which is the scale-free network. So everybody is equal. We are believers, we are post-feminists. We are believers in equalism, for everybody, equalism. And that means that people can look at what we're saying. They can contribute their own comments on the page, which I'd urge people to do. I think the open debate is a really important thing. They can be ambassadors for us. People in other countries can, of course, set up their own nodes of open minds. We do have some ethical guidelines. We're about trying to help people. And it's very important that we're always attentive to any complaint or criticism. But yes, we'd very much like people to look at, hosting events for open minds, tweeting, hooting, doing whatever going on Facebook to let people know about what we're doing and pointing people towards our content, which is, I don't think it's controversial anymore. The social psychology was largely done under, and this isn't a conspiracy theory either, but under US military funding from 1945 to Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment in 71, I think it was. Most of that was funded by the US military. And during that period, they did things which are ethically impossible now, like the Stanley Milgram studies. But they gave us, a template that shows us how societies work, and it contains, things like, I say that the most important thing to understand is confirmation bias. If you want to talk with people, you have to understand that they're going to listen to what confirms their beliefs, and they're going to throw away what disconfirms their beliefs. And then you have to turn that lens on yourself. And, as John Stuart Mill was recommending in the mid-19th century, you have to be willing to listen to whatever people have to offer to you, even if you've heard it before, even if you think the person's an idiot, because you could be wrong. You could be wrong. And we've seen enough historically to see that. So what I'd ask people to do is to find out about what we do, and to see how their organization or their family or they themselves can help us move that along. I think ex-cult members who've digested the experience and people who've looked at the cult situation have very special tools that they can share with society. And, they can $5 a month or whatever would be, whatever people can manage is great. But we want people to be actively involved. To actually be spreading this through the society.
Okay, and where can people find you on like Twitter and Facebook?
Well, the Open Minds Foundation. If you stick that into Facebook, you'll find us. Probably the first thing to do is to go to our webpage, our website. We're developing further. Our next phase, we've got written stuff and some lovely cartoons. We want to now put some little video courses, with some whiteboarding and So we're looking at the moment for donations to go to that project to say, we will explain manipulation. And the amazing thing, it hit me with some of the stuff we've been working on. I've been working in this field really my whole life because I got into Scientology to try to understand these things, as a teenager. So I've spent 45 years now looking into these things. And the other week I saw, it's a great online video of Bob Cialdini's 6 Methods of Influence. And it's had, millions of views, quite rightly. And looking at this thing, I realized that, I spent years, I read Influence a couple of times, the book, and I spent years absorbing this information. It's actually possible when you pare it down to tell somebody in an hour, something that will protect them for a lifetime, that will help them. If I'd known as much about narcissists, when I was 19, the first paragraph of any Ron Hubbard book, I'd have gone, whoa, no, don't want to do that. Because the guy's the same is true for Freud, by the way, and Jung. There have been quite a lot of people that they're just self-obsessed. And that is never a sign of a good working intellect. If people don't have humility, then they won't be able to think, because they'll believe they'll believe their own bullshit, basically. They won't be able to question themselves.
Well, it sounds to me like in a lot of ways you guys are pretty aligned with what we're doing over here. We're just a little more loud and rambunctious than you guys are.
Good to have different styles out there. Good to have different styles.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So it was really great to talk to you and great to meet you. And I hope maybe we can continue the conversation another time. Yeah,
that would be great. I look forward to it.
Okay. This has been a Plex interview with John Atack. I said that right. And once again, I'd like to thank Karen De La Carriere for setting this up. Hey, John, thanks for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.